$427,316. That's how much my wife thought she hid from me, and the truth is I knew about it long before she ever believed she got away with anything. I just never said a word, not when the first account appeared, not when the transfers started showing up in patterns too clean to be accidental, and definitely not when the balance crossed 6 figures, because by then I wasn't reacting anymore, I was watching. And there's a difference most people don't understand until it's too late. My name is Daniel Carter, I'm 41 years old, and for most of my life I believed marriage was built on trust, not the kind you talk about over dinner or post about on anniversaries, but the quiet kind, the kind that shows up in shared accounts, in long-term plans, in the assumption that the person sleeping next to you isn't quietly rewriting the rules of your life behind your back. For 12 years Olivia and I built what looked like a stable, comfortable life in a suburb just outside Chicago, 2 cars in the driveway, a mortgage that never missed a payment, retirement accounts slowly climbing like they were supposed to, and from the outside nothing about it looked unusual. Nothing about her looked unusual either. She was smart, organized, the kind of woman who kept spreadsheets for grocery lists and color-coded calendars for holidays, the kind of person people trusted without thinking twice. And that's exactly why it took me a little longer than it should have to see it, because when someone is that precise, that controlled, the truth doesn't show up as chaos. It shows up as something just slightly off, something you can almost explain away if you're not paying attention. The first time I noticed it was a transfer, small enough to ignore. A few $100s routed somewhere I didn't recognize. I told myself it was probably a bill I forgot about or an account we opened years ago and never used. Something normal. Something harmless. And that's the story I let myself believe for about 3 weeks, until the next one came, and then another, each one clean, deliberate, never large enough to trigger a conversation but never random enough to be an accident, and that's when something shifted, not in her, but in me. Because most people in that moment would confront, they'd ask questions, demand answers, try to fix the situation before it grew into something bigger. But I didn't do any of that. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't even bring it up. I just started paying closer attention, because there's a kind of clarity that comes when you stop reacting and start observing. And once you see the pattern you can't unsee it. The accounts weren't mistakes, they were intentional. Structured, almost elegant in the way they moved money out of sight without ever making noise, and the more I watched, the more I realized this wasn't something that started recently. This had been going on for years, quietly building under the surface of a marriage I thought I understood, and the strangest part wasn't the money itself, it was how normal everything else stayed. She still smiled at dinner, still asked about my day, still talked about future plans like nothing had changed, like there wasn't a second version of our life running parallel to the one I was living, and that's when I made a decision most people wouldn't agree with. I decided to say nothing, not because I was afraid, not because I didn't care, but because I wanted to know how far it went, how deep it ran, and what she would do if she believed no one was watching. So I stayed quiet, and while she kept moving money, I started tracking it. Every dollar, every transfer, every account, because if there's one thing I've learned in business and in life, it's that numbers don't lie, people do, and eventually those two things collide. The truth just depends on who's patient enough to wait for it. If you had asked me back then why I did not confront her, I would have given you a simple answer, something clean and easy to accept, like I did not want to start a fight or I needed more proof. But the truth is more complicated than that, because the moment I realized what was happening, something in me shifted in a way I could not undo. I stopped seeing our finances as something shared and started seeing them as something being quietly divided. And once that line is crossed, you cannot go back to ignorance. You cannot pretend everything is still whole. So instead of reacting, I adapted. I opened a separate notebook at first, nothing digital, nothing that could be accidentally discovered, just a simple black cover notebook I kept in my desk drawer. And every time I saw a transaction that did not belong, I wrote it down. The date, the amount, the destination. At the beginning it felt almost unnecessary. Like I was overreacting to something small. But patterns do not reveal themselves all at once, they build slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. and within a few weeks the picture started to come into focus. The transfers were not random, they followed a rhythm, usually late in the evening, often after she had spent time on her laptop in the living room, sometimes just after midnight when she thought I was asleep, and I remember lying there in bed more than once, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint tapping of her keyboard from the other room, realizing that while I thought the day was over, hers was still in motion, and not in a way that included me. That realization did not come with anger, not immediately. It came with something colder, something quieter, the understanding that I was no longer part of the full picture, and that if I wanted to understand what was really happening, I would have to step outside of the role I had been playing for years. So I did. I stopped asking casual questions about bills, stopped double-checking statements in front of her, stopped doing anything that might signal I was paying attention, and in doing that, I gave her exactly what she needed to continue, the illusion that everything was normal, and people are most revealing when they feel safe, when they believe no one is watching. Over the next few months the numbers grew, slowly at first, then with more confidence, the amounts increased, the intervals became more consistent. And eventually I noticed something that changed everything. The money was not just being moved, it was being stored, consolidated into accounts that were not connected to anything we had ever discussed, accounts that had structure, purpose, intent, and that is when I understood this was not about a mistake, or even a temporary decision. This was a long-term plan, something she had been building quietly while I was busy believing we were building something together, and that realization should have been the moment I confronted her, should have been the moment I demanded answers, but instead it became the moment I committed fully to what I had started, because by then I was not just noticing anymore, I was tracking. I moved everything into a secure digital system, one that mirrored our financial activity but existed completely outside of her awareness. I categorized every transaction, linked every account, built timelines that showed not just where the money went but how it moved, how it evolved, and what it was becoming, and the more complete the system became, the more I realized something else, something most people overlook when they think about situations like this. The person who acts first does not always win, the person who understands the system does, and while she was moving money, believing she was creating distance, I was building a map, and maps have power, not immediately, not in a dramatic way, but in a precise, controlled way, the kind of power that does not need to announce itself because it already knows exactly where everything leads, and by the time she felt comfortable enough to stop being careful, by the time she started acting like the version of reality she had created was the only one that existed, I had already seen the entire structure for what it was, not just hidden money, but a quiet separation, one she thought I would never notice, and one I was no longer interested in stopping, because at some point the goal changes. It is no longer about preventing the truth, it is about letting it fully reveal itself on its own terms, and making sure when it does, you are the only one prepared for what comes next. There is a moment when observation stops feeling like patience and starts feeling like distance, and I realized I had crossed that line one quiet Sunday morning sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand while Olivia moved around the house like everything was exactly as it should be, sunlight coming through the window, the sound of the dishwasher humming, the kind of ordinary scene that used to mean stability, but now it felt staged, like I was watching a version of our life instead of living inside it, and the strange part was how easy it became to play along. I would nod at the right moments, answer her questions, talk about work, plans, weekends, all the normal things, and none of it felt forced. Because after a while you learn that performance is not about pretending something is true. It is about understanding what the other person expects to see and giving them exactly that. And Olivia expected normal. She expected a husband who trusted her, who did not question small inconsistencies, who believed the version of reality she presented, and so I gave her that version without resistance, because every time she relaxed, every time she acted without caution, the system I was building became more complete, more precise, and what started as simple tracking turned into something much deeper. I began to see not just the transactions but the intent behind them, the way she timed transfers around certain events, the way larger amounts appeared after specific conversations about expenses or future plans, the way she adjusted her behavior depending on what she thought I knew, and once you see intent, the situation changes. It is no longer about money, it is about control, about narrative, about who defines what is real inside a relationship, and that realization changed the way I approached everything. I stopped thinking like a husband trying to fix a problem and started thinking like someone documenting a pattern. I expanded the system, cross-referencing bank statements with credit activity, mapping out timelines that connected financial movement with daily life, and slowly the structure revealed itself in full, not chaotic, not reckless, but deliberate, organized, almost disciplined, which made it harder to ignore and easier to understand because this was not a moment of weakness. This was a strategy, one she had committed to over time, and the more I understood it, the calmer I became, not because it did not matter, but because clarity removes panic, it replaces emotion with direction, and direction gives you control. I remember one evening in particular, we were sitting on the couch watching a show neither of us was really paying attention to. Her phone lit up briefly and she glanced at it with that quick, controlled movement I had come to recognize. Subtle enough that most people would miss it, but by then I noticed everything. And a few hours later I saw the corresponding transaction appear, small, clean, executed with the same precision I had documented dozens of times before, and in that moment it became clear that nothing about this was accidental anymore, not her actions, not my silence. Everything was moving forward exactly as designed, just not in the same direction, and instead of confronting that reality, I leaned into it. Because by then confrontation would not have given me answers, it would have ended the process before it revealed everything. And what I needed was not a partial truth, I needed the full picture, every account, every pathway, every decision layered over time, because only then would I understand not just what she had done, but how she had built it without me seeing it, and more importantly, how I could respond without losing control of the situation. So I kept going, day after day, transaction after transaction, building something she did not know existed, a complete record of a reality she believed was hidden. And the more complete it became, the more I understood something that most people overlook. The person who controls the information controls the outcome, and while she believed she was creating distance, I was creating clarity, and clarity, when it is complete, becomes something far more powerful than reaction. It becomes leverage. Leverage is a quiet thing. It does not announce itself, it does not rush, and it does not make noise unless it needs to, and by the time I understood exactly how much of it I had, the situation had already changed in ways Olivia could not see, because while she was focused on moving money out of sight, I was focused on understanding where that money would eventually lead, not just the accounts but the purpose behind them. And purpose leaves patterns, even when people think they are being careful. I started noticing how her decisions began to extend beyond finances, small changes at first, the way she talked about future plans, the way she hesitated when certain topics came up, especially anything related to long-term commitments, retirement, property, anything that required transparency, and those moments told me more than the transactions ever could. Because money can be hidden, but intention has a way of showing itself in conversation, in timing, in the spaces between what is said and what is avoided, and once I started listening for that, the picture became clearer. She was not just creating a safety net, she was creating separation, not immediate, not obvious, but structured, something that could be activated when she decided the timing was right, and that realization changed the way I approached my own decisions. Because until that point I had been focused on understanding her system, but now I needed to build my own. Something that did not interfere with what she was doing, something that existed parallel to it, something that would only matter when the moment came. So I began making adjustments quietly, small at first, changes that would not draw attention, shifting certain assets, restructuring accounts in ways that were completely legal but not immediately visible, creating layers that required context to understand. And context was something only I had. I remember sitting in my home office one night with multiple screens open, spreadsheets aligned, timelines mapped out down to the smallest detail, and for the first time I was not just documenting anymore. I was planning, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Because once you see the full structure of something like this, doing nothing is no longer an option, But acting too soon is just as dangerous. Timing becomes everything. And timing depends on information, complete information, not assumptions, not guesses. And that is what I had been building from the beginning, a complete record, one that could not be dismissed, could not be explained away, because it was not based on a single moment, it was based on years of consistent behavior, and the more I refined it, the more confident I became, not in the outcome, but in my position within it, because for the first time since I noticed that first transfer, I was no longer reacting to what she had done, I was preparing for what I would do next, and that shift changes everything. It removes uncertainty, it replaces doubt with clarity. And clarity allows you to move without hesitation when the time comes, and what made it even more effective was that nothing on the surface changed. Our daily life continued exactly as before, dinners, conversations, routines, everything intact, because the strongest position is the one no one sees coming, and Olivia did not see anything, not the system I had built, not the adjustments I had made, not the fact that every move she made was now part of a larger picture that she did not control, and the more comfortable she became, the more predictable her actions were, which only made the structure stronger, more complete, more undeniable, and by the time the total crossed the threshold I had marked months earlier, a number that represented not just money but intent, I knew I had reached the point where observation was no longer enough. Everything that needed to be seen had been seen, everything that needed to be understood had been understood, and the only thing left was the moment when all of it would matter, not in fragments, not in pieces, but all at once, because leverage only works when it is revealed at the right time, and when it is, it does not need to be explained, it simply speaks for itself. The moment I stopped collecting and started anticipating was not loud or dramatic, it did not come with a confrontation or a discovery, it came in the form of a simple realization that her behavior was no longer evolving, it had stabilized, and when a pattern stabilizes, it means the person behind it believes they have reached a position of safety, and that is when they become predictable. And predictability is where control begins to shift. I noticed it in the way Olivia moved through her days. There was less caution in her timing, fewer pauses before transactions, fewer subtle checks to see if I was paying attention, and more confidence in everything she did, like someone who had tested a system long enough to trust it completely, and that confidence showed up in small ways most people would miss, the way she spoke about money with a little more distance, the way she framed conversations about the future with just enough vagueness to avoid specifics, the way she no longer felt the need to justify certain expenses because, in her mind, the real structure was already somewhere else, and what we shared was just the surface. And I remember thinking how strange it was that two people could sit at the same table, share the same space, and still be operating in completely different realities. Because while she believed she had secured her position, I had already moved beyond understanding it, I had started shaping mine, I refined the system further, not just tracking but forecasting. Projecting where the numbers would go based on her established behavior, identifying thresholds where decisions would likely change, mapping out scenarios not as guesses but as logical extensions of everything I had already seen. And once you reach that level of clarity, something interesting happens. The situation stops feeling personal, it becomes structural, almost mechanical, like watching a process unfold exactly the way it was designed to, and the emotion that was there at the beginning fades into something more controlled. More precise, not indifference, but focus, and that focus allowed me to prepare in ways that would have been impossible if I had acted too soon. I adjusted legal frameworks quietly, consulted professionals without ever revealing the full context, asked the kind of hypothetical questions that do not raise concern but give you exactly the answers you need, and piece by piece I built a position that did not depend on confrontation, it depended on timing, and timing depends on readiness. Not just your own, but the other person's, because the most effective moment to act is not when you first discover something, it is when the other person believes the situation is complete, when they have fully committed to their version of reality. And Olivia had reached that point. I could see it clearly, in her tone, in her confidence, in the absence of hesitation, and that was when I knew the process was no longer about gathering information, it was about waiting for alignment, the moment when everything I had built intersected with everything she believed was secure, and that moment does not arrive suddenly, it builds quietly, just like everything else in this situation. Until one day the conditions are simply there, and you recognize it without needing to question it. I remember standing in the garage one evening, the door half open, the sound of the neighborhood settling into the night, and thinking about how far things had moved without a single argument, without a single raised voice, just time, observation, and structure, and in that moment I understood something that most people learn too late: control is not about force, it is about positioning. And positioning is built long before it is ever revealed, and by the time it is revealed, the outcome is usually already decided, not because one person was stronger, but because one person was prepared, and I was prepared, not in a way that required urgency, but in a way that required patience, because the final step in a process like this is not action, it is precision, knowing exactly when to move and exactly how much to reveal, because when everything is aligned, when the structure is complete and the timing is right, you do not need to say much at all, the truth carries its own weight, and all you have to do is let it land. The day I knew it was time did not come with a warning, it came quietly, like everything else in this process, and if you were standing in the same room you would not have noticed anything different. Olivia was at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone, sunlight hitting the granite just right, coffee still steaming in her mug, the kind of normal moment we had repeated hundreds of times before, but there was something in the way she moved. Something settled, like she had reached the end of her own planning without realizing I had reached the end of mine long before that. And that is the thing about timing, it is rarely about a specific event, it is about alignment, and everything in that moment told me the alignment was there. Her system was complete, my system was complete, and the only thing left was the intersection. I did not rush it, I never rushed anything in this process, I simply adjusted, I shifted my attention from building to execution, not dramatic, not visible, just small changes in how I positioned information, how I prepared access, how I ensured that when the moment came, nothing would depend on memory or explanation. Everything would already be in place, because the strongest move is the one that requires the least effort to prove, and I had already done the work, every transaction categorized, every timeline mapped, every connection documented in a way that did not require interpretation, just recognition, and that recognition was what mattered, not what I would say, but what she would see, because people can argue with words. They can challenge opinions, but they cannot argue with their own patterns when those patterns are laid out in front of them with precision. I remember sitting in my office late one night, reviewing everything one last time, not because I needed to find something new, but because I wanted to see the full picture without interruption, years of decisions condensed into something that could be understood in minutes, and as I scrolled through it, I realized something that surprised even me: there was no anger left in it. Not the kind people expect in situations like this. What I felt instead was clarity, a kind of calm that only comes when there are no more unknowns, no more questions waiting for answers, just a structure that has already revealed everything it needed to reveal, and that clarity made the next step simple, not easy, but simple. I chose the moment carefully, not based on convenience, but on impact, a time when there would be no distractions, no external pressure. Just the two of us and the reality that had been building between us without being acknowledged. It was a Thursday evening, nothing significant about it on the surface, dinner finished, dishes done, the house settling into that quiet space between day and night, and I asked her to sit down, not in a confrontational way, not with urgency, just a calm request that did not signal anything unusual, and she sat, relaxed, unaware, still operating inside the version of reality she had built for herself, and for a moment I just looked at her, not trying to read her, not trying to predict her reaction, just observing, the same way I had been observing everything else for so long. And then I turned the laptop toward her, not with a speech, not with an accusation, just a simple gesture, because at that point words were unnecessary. Everything that mattered was already there, organized, precise, undeniable, and the shift in that moment was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, because when someone sees the full reflection of what they thought was hidden, there is a pause, a recalibration, a moment where the narrative they believed in no longer holds. And they realize they are not in control of the situation anymore. And I did not fill that silence, I let it exist. Because silence, when backed by truth, does more than any argument ever could, and for the first time since this began, everything was no longer divided between what she knew and what I knew. It was all in the same place, all visible, all undeniable, and that was the moment the process ended, not with a fight, not with a reaction, but with a realization that had been years in the making. She did not speak right away, and that silence told me more than anything she could have said, because it was not confusion, it was recognition, the kind that happens when someone realizes the version of reality they believed in has just been replaced by something they cannot control. Her eyes moved across the screen slowly at first, then faster, tracing the timelines, the transactions. The connections that had once existed only in fragments now laid out in a structure that left no room for interpretation, and I watched her process it, not with anger, not with panic, but with calculation, because Olivia had always been someone who thought in systems, and now she was seeing one she did not build, one she did not even know existed, and for the first time since I had noticed that first transfer, the balance between us shifted in a way that could not be undone. She looked up eventually, not startled, not defensive, just quiet, and asked a single question, "How long?" And I answered without hesitation, "Long enough." Because the exact number did not matter, what mattered was that it had been consistent, deliberate, complete, and she understood that. You could see it in the way her posture changed slightly, not collapsing, not retreating, just adjusting, recalibrating to a reality where she no longer held the advantage. And what happened next was not what most people would expect. There was no denial, no attempt to dismiss what she was seeing, because she knew better. She knew the difference between something that could be explained away and something that had already been proven, and this was the latter. So instead she shifted to something else, something more subtle. She tried to reframe it, to bring it back into a narrative where it could still be managed. She spoke about security, about independence, about planning for the future, the kind of language that sounds reasonable on the surface, the kind that gives actions a context that softens them. But context only works when both people are operating from the same set of facts, and we were not anymore, because everything she was saying existed in a version of the story that had already been replaced by something more complete. And I did not interrupt her, I let her speak, the same way I had let everything else unfold. Because the point was not to argue, it was to let the contrast exist, the difference between what she believed she had done and what had actually been built over time. And when she finished, there was another pause, not empty, but heavy with understanding, and that is when I spoke again, not to accuse, not to demand, but to clarify. I told her that this was not about a single decision or even a series of decisions. It was about a structure, something that had been developed over years without acknowledgement, and that structure had consequences, not emotional ones, not immediate ones, but practical ones, real ones, the kind that affect everything moving forward, and I could see it register, not in a dramatic way, but in the way her focus sharpened, the way she started looking at the screen differently, no longer scanning but studying, because now she was not just seeing what had happened, she was trying to understand what it meant, and that was the moment the control fully shifted, not when the information was revealed, but when she realized she needed it to understand her own position, and that is a quiet kind of power. The kind that does not need to be asserted, because it is already there, embedded in the structure itself, and I did not need to explain what would happen next. I did not need to outline consequences or make demands, because the system we were both looking at had already done that. It had defined the situation with a level of clarity that left very little room for negotiation, and for the first time since this began, we were both looking at the same reality, not her version, not mine, but the one that had been built piece by piece over time, and in that shared understanding, something settled, not resolution, not yet, but direction, because once everything is visible, the next steps are no longer about discovery, they are about decision, and decisions, when they are based on complete information, tend to follow a path that is much harder to avoid, even for someone who believed they had been in control all along. Once everything was on the table, the conversation stopped being about what had happened and started becoming about what could no longer be undone. And that shift is subtle but permanent, because when a structure like that is exposed, it does not disappear, it simply changes ownership. And I could see Olivia realizing that in real time, not through words but through the way her attention moved across the screen again, slower now. More deliberate, not searching for gaps anymore but understanding the full weight of what had been built, and what it meant for both of us moving forward. She asked fewer questions after that, and the ones she did ask were different, no longer about the past but about the implications, about how the system worked, how the accounts connected, what I had done on my side, and that was when the dynamic fully changed, because the information she had once controlled was no longer enough. She needed mine to understand the outcome, and that is where leverage becomes reality, not in the moment of exposure, but in the dependency that follows it. I explained only what was necessary, not everything, because complete transparency is not the same as clarity, and clarity does not require you to give up your position. It only requires you to define the structure in a way that cannot be misunderstood. I showed her how the timelines aligned, how the transfers corresponded with decisions she had made, how the system she believed was hidden had created a record more detailed than anything either of us could have built intentionally. And as she followed it, piece by piece, the situation stopped being abstract and became something tangible, something with consequences that extended beyond the moment we were in. And that is when she leaned back slightly, not defeated, not emotional, just still, the kind of stillness that comes when someone recognizes that the next move is no longer about control but about response. And I did not push her. I did not rush that moment, because forcing a reaction would have weakened the clarity that had already been established. Instead, I let the structure speak, the same way it had been speaking to me for months, quietly, consistently, without exaggeration or distortion. And in that silence, something else became clear. This was no longer about proving anything. That part was already complete. This was about defining what came next based on a reality that neither of us could ignore. And that is where most situations like this fall apart, because people try to return to a version of normal that no longer exists. They try to negotiate from emotion or from fragments of information. But we were not in that position. Everything was visible, everything was understood. And that removed the usual pathways people take to avoid difficult decisions. There was no misunderstanding to resolve, no hidden detail to uncover, just a structure that had already determined the range of possible outcomes. And within that range, choices become clearer, not easier, but clearer. And I could see Olivia processing that, not resisting it, not accepting it immediately, but moving through it in a way that reflected who she had always been. Someone who adapts when the system changes, someone who recalibrates rather than reacts. And that made the moment even more defined, because it meant we were both now operating from the same level of awareness. And when that happens, the situation stops being about conflict and becomes about alignment, not agreement, but alignment with reality. And reality does not negotiate, it simply exists, and you either adjust to it or you do not. And by the time she looked back at me, there was no need for a long conversation, no need for explanations or justifications, because everything that needed to be said had already been laid out in front of us, not in words, but in patterns, in timelines, in numbers that carried more meaning than any argument ever could. And in that moment, the final stage of the process began, not with action, but with acceptance of what was already in motion. Acceptance does not look the way people expect it to. It is not a nod, not a clear statement, not even a visible change in expression. It is quieter than that. It is the absence of resistance, the moment when someone stops trying to reshape reality and begins to move within it instead. And that is what I saw in Olivia as she closed the laptop slowly, not with hesitation, not with reluctance, but with a kind of measured control that told me she understood exactly where things stood. We sat there for a moment without speaking, the room unchanged, the same walls, the same furniture, the same life surrounding us, but the structure underneath it had shifted completely. And once that happens, there is no way back to what existed before, not because it is impossible, but because it is no longer real. And I realized in that moment that everything I had built, every record, every timeline, every quiet decision to wait instead of react, had led to something far more significant than a Confrontation. It had led to clarity, not just for me, but for both of us, and clarity has a way of simplifying things that once felt complicated. It removes the noise, the assumptions, the half-truths people rely on to maintain comfort, and replaces them with something solid, something that cannot be ignored or reinterpreted. And once that clarity is there, the next steps are not driven by emotion, they are driven by structure, by what is possible, what is practical, what aligns with the reality in front of you. Olivia was the first to stand, not abruptly, not as an escape. Just a natural movement that marked the transition from understanding to decision, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, not defensive, not apologetic, just direct. She acknowledged the system, not in detail, not with explanations, but with recognition, and that was enough, because recognition means the conversation no longer needs to revolve around proof, it can move forward, and that is exactly what we did, not with dramatic declarations or final ultimatums, but with a series of quiet, precise decisions that reflected the reality we were now both aware of. Discussions about accounts, about separation of assets, about the logistics that most people avoid until they are forced into them, but for us there was no forcing, just alignment with what had already been built over time, and as those decisions unfolded, I noticed something that stayed with me long after that night. There was no sense of victory in it, no feeling of having won something. Because situations like this are not competitions, they are revelations, they show you what has been happening beneath the surface, and once you see it fully, the idea of winning becomes irrelevant. What matters is understanding and what you choose to do with that understanding, and for me, the choice was simple, not easy, but simple. I chose to move forward with the clarity I had earned, not to hold on to what was no longer aligned with reality, not to pretend things could return to what they were, but to step into what they had become. And that decision did not come with a sense of loss the way people might expect. It came with a kind of quiet certainty, the kind that replaces doubt when there are no more questions left unanswered, and as the days that followed settled into a new rhythm, different from before but not chaotic, I realized something that had been true from the beginning. Silence is not weakness, it is a form of preparation, and preparation, when done with patience and precision, leads to outcomes that do not need to be forced, they simply unfold, and in the end, what mattered was not the money, not the accounts, not even the system itself. It was the fact that I had seen the full picture and chosen to respond with clarity instead of reaction, because once you understand everything, truly understand it, you are no longer reacting to someone else's actions, you are deciding your own direction, and that is the only kind of control that actually lasts.